All right, everybody, how you doing today? We are here with Daniel Goodrich, corporate attorney and founder of Virtual Counsel. I am a physical therapist, Brett Kestenbaum. I am one of the co-founders of Covalent Careers, and today we are going to be talking about employment agreements for physical therapists. Now, Danny, the first question I have for you, very simply, is why are employment agreements important both for an employer and for a physical therapist as well when engaging in an employment relationship?
Yeah, great question. Look, it sounds simple, but it is very important. Having a document in place protects both you and the employer. More importantly, it gives you both tools to take whatever verbal conversation you had and memorialize it into an agreement that you can always look back on when looking at compensation or performance evaluations, or what we'll get into a little later is the scope of your duties. What are you doing as an employee? Having it in writing puts that all to rest pretty early on.
Yeah, so I think the big take-home points here are that the agreement itself establishes the relationship and it sets the expectations for both the employee and the employer, so that okay, maybe when this agreement's going back and forth, there's a little bit of negotiation about the terms, right. But once it's done, everybody understands specifically what the role of the job is and then what the expectations are for both the employer from their perspective and then the employee's perspective as well.
It's perfectly stated, and as you'll see as we go through the document that we have for you, expectations on both ends, the employer's end and your end, are really, really important to set forth.
Now, we want to make this as fun and engaging as possible. It's a topic that is obviously legal, and there's going to be a lot of legal stuff going on here, but we're going to try to keep it short and sweet for you, but we're really going to be going through this contract, and we're going to be diving in and seeing all those points, and we're going to be pointing out things that'll be important for physical therapists to look at when they're going to be engaging in an employment agreement and employment relationship.
Exactly. You could take this document, compare it to whatever employment agreement you're given to review and sign, and sort of do it yourself and do a little bit of investigation.
So let's dive right in here.
All right. So first and foremost, there's going to be a date of this agreement. We want to take a look at the date, see if there are several different dates within the agreement, and just make sure they're consistent. It sounds incredibly simple, but all too often there'll be a date that's either before your actual start date on the contract, or a date that's after your actual start date. We want to make sure that everything you do all starts from one master date. So that sounds simple, but that's the first thing that pops up. The next section is important when we were talking about expectations, right? The scope of your duties, how much time you're putting into this new employment, this new job of yours, right? What are you doing at the job? You may have an idea of what you're going to be doing, how much time you're spending, and the employer may have something different. So we want to make sure that there's nothing vague in here. So we want to take a look for vague language and either address it right here in the document when you ask for a revision to the agreement, or at bare minimum, you have that conversation with the employer to start. What is common? What is commonly expected, and how do other employees typically do their job?
So just for clarity here, and I think a lot of people, this may or may not be their first time seeing an employment agreement.
Right.
Are all employment agreements written the same with the same structure and the same format, or is there variation between different employment agreements when it comes specifically to the structure and the content within them?
It's a great question. They're absolutely different. Everyone looks and feels a little different. They all have or should have the same type of structure and the same types of clauses. If you have an employment agreement in front of you that varies drastically from this, that could be a red flag. But generally speaking, these types of clauses and these terms are going to be in every employment agreement.
So before we go through all of them one by one, can
Sure.
you just bullet point out
Yeah.
the specific sections that we may want to consider or we may be looking for in an employment agreement?
Sure. So first and foremost, the first thing I mentioned was date, term of the agreement,
Okay.
Date, how long it's going to be, when does it renew, if at all. Compensation, obviously, is a big one. The terms of that compensation, how many different ways are you going to be compensated and in what ways. Expectations, so duties, what is your job duty? How broad are your duties as a physical therapist in this new position, or how narrow are they? We also want to look at other things like competition or non-competition, right? Are you able to change your position and work for a new employer at a given time? Is it a competitor? Are you restricted by the contract or not? There's plenty of others that we'll go through. Those are the heavy hitters that are most important for you to take a look at.
Okay, so when we're first looking at an agreement, and we were just talking about red flags before, if it doesn't have those specific things in it, we may want to think about, hey, why aren't those specific sections included? Maybe not the non-compete. Some contracts may have that, right? Other contracts
Correct.
may not. And likely for you as a physical therapist, it's a little bit better for you if it doesn't have that section, because that section, correct me if I'm wrong, would be a restrictive covenant against you, the employee. But at the same time, most contracts will likely have some sort of language about what happens if the employment is terminated either by you or by the employer.
Correct. The clauses that are of most interest to you are certainly compensation and duties.
Compensation and duties, so those should always be in there.
Absolutely.
To make it crystal clear as to what is being done and what is being received for the work, value for value transaction.
Well stated.
Excellent. All right,
Yeah.
so let's dive in here again. We were at, I believe, scope of work.
Scope of duties.
Scope of
Yeah.
duties.
So this section, I've highlighted some language that, when reviewing it, feel very vague to me. This part in particular, right? You're working on a Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. That seems reasonable, but may include occasional Saturdays and Sundays. What is occasional, right? Is that once every quarter, once every month, once every week? We want to be careful and look at this comment here of what we're calling creep, schedule creep, right? You want to have a good understanding of what the typical day-to-day looks like, what the typical week looks like, what your patient load is going to be. And this here is just simply too vague, in my opinion.
So let's just frame this in a way that is important for the physical therapist to understand. Is this something that, if they see this, they should be trying to negotiate it out of the contract, or should they just more likely be just trying to get a better understanding of what the employer means by this occasional Saturday, occasional Sunday?
It's a great question, Brett. Look, you are coming in, and if it's not your first job, it may be close to it. You are coming in often as a newcomer, a guest to this new employer, right? You don't want to be so hard on negotiating your hours, right? But again, expectations. It's much more the latter. You don't necessarily want to strike this from the agreement or insist that it's removed. You just want to have clarification.
Gotcha.
This next section, C, administrative services. Now, here, we're feeling that this is a bit of not schedule creep, but what we're calling scope creep, right? You are being hired, from our understanding, to provide patient services, right? To patient care. That's what you went to school for. That's what you're being hired for. That's your profession and your specialty. But we want to know if that scope of work is going to creep into other things like marketing, sales, admin work. This here suggests that at the owner or the employer's discretion, they're going to give you that type of work. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but again, expectations. You want to be very, very clear on what is the scope of that work. How regular is that going to be part of your day-to-day? What does the staff look like at this clinic? Do they have enough staff to handle this, or are you going to be wearing multiple hats?
Right, and I think for some physical therapists, this may be an exciting clause, and it also, for others, it may be something that they potentially could get upset about. And what I mean by that is, as a physical therapist, we can look at our career and our journey in our careers in a lot of different ways, and some people might want to become business owners one day. So if a practice is going to be teaching us how to do some of those things like marketing or sales, or maybe even expecting us to learn how to do those things on our own, and we have the opportunity to implement them in a practice, that's a great opportunity for some people. Even things like the admin work, how does the billing work? How are we billing Medicare? How are we billing other companies? If the practice is going to teach us those things within the work, that might be a bonus. On the other hand, if you're a physical therapist and you're really only just looking to become the best physical therapist possible, or maybe even just a pretty good physical therapist and treat patients 9 to 5, whatever the hours are, go home, then this might be something you really want to dive into and say, hey, what is this going to look like, and things like that.
Agreed. And again, you want to understand what you're getting into before you sign a contract. Other services, same point, just driving it at home, right? Here, this contract broadly states you're agreeing to perform whatever reasonable tasks and job assignments that are given to you. What does that really mean? We want to be clear on that.
So what I'm hearing is that there are kind of keywords that we want to look for, the whatever reasonable, anything that sounds like a broad term and it's not specifically defined. Those are things we want to look for, and if those are present, then maybe we want to not necessarily negotiate them out, but at least ask questions about what those mean.
Expectations and clarification.
Got it.
This next section is a big one, compensation. We want to take a moment to just discuss what's a reasonable compensation, how is that compensation structured, and this can and should be a place where you would negotiate. This is dollars and cents, right? From a general perspective, Brett, we understand that base pay is going to range, right? It could be as low as, say, $50,000 a year, and we've seen contracts that are up to $120,000 a year for a new grad. What factors, what factors come into play here?
Yeah, the biggest ones are going to be location and practice setting that are going to come into play for the amount of compensation that you're going to receive as a physical therapist. And it's fortunate and unfortunate as sometimes. The fortunate thing about being a physical therapist when it comes to your compensation is typically there's a lot of stability there, and you're going to come out of school and you're going to be within that range. Sometimes you be in an environment where you're going to be on that lower range. A lot of that can do with the desirability of a location or simply the reimbursement that is provided in that location. Reimbursement from insurance companies can differ from location to location and practice setting to practice setting. So location and practice setting are going to be the two biggest determinants on the compensation that a physical therapist is provided, or offered, at least I should say.
And what about production bonus, right? Don't freak out if you have a low base. If it's supplemented potentially with other compensation, it could be very reasonable. Where does production bonus come into play?
Sure. So again, this goes back to what are your career goals? What type of risk do you want to put in your career, or what type of risk profile are you looking for? Usually a private practice or an outpatient facility will offer more so production bonuses and things like that, where you might be doing things like marketing for a clinic or going into the community and doing a talk just like this one. And that's to help the practice and yourself attract more patients. And when you do that, your expectation may be to be compensated for that. So although you're doing this additional work or maybe just a different type of work, that's the time where you'll want to see a production bonus, and you want to be collecting on the high end, the opportunity that you're creating. So if you're that type of person who is looking for an opportunity to say, hey, I have value for your clinic, and here's my value, and this is what I can do for you. You know that you're a valuable asset to a clinic because you're going to be either driving more patients, or you're able to effectively treat patients, more patients during a day because you're great with your documentation or whatever it might be. Then those are things you can negotiate either in for yourself, or maybe the employer even has it in the agreement already, which would be that production bonus. So with the production bonus, you're looking for the high upside, but like you were describing, the base might be lower there. It's a trade. It's a value for value trade there. Higher upside, essentially higher downside too, because the base is going to be lower.
Now, if we're starting with a low base, what about raises, right? What's common and what's a schedule for you to anticipate and follow to get raises? Oftentimes you're going to find in your contract, no surprise, it's not in there. There is potentially an expectation and a common track for new grads to graduate within the organization to get more better hours potentially, or better shifts. and raises. But if it's not in there, again, we get back to expectations. We want to at least have somewhere in writing a quarterly performance evaluation, a 6-month evaluation where salary is a topic of discussion. Here's what happens in a busy clinic. If it's not on their calendar, the conversation's not going to happen. It's just going to get pushed off. If you set that expectation from the get-go, you'll at least be able to put that calendar event in front of your employer when that time comes and say, hey, it's time to talk about salary. What we want to now get into is duties, expectations in the clinic, right? We already talked about, hours and schedule creep and scope creep, right? But what about a list of specifically what you're supposed to do? Here we have what we think is actually really clear and helpful. It's the employer telling you specifically what their expectations are. Oftentimes, you're not going to find a contract with it so well laid out. So when you're reviewing your contract, you want to take a look at what the employer expects of you. Is it very clear? Is it unclear? Oftentimes, there will be a reference to some external document, an employee handbook, right? You are bound to the terms and the expectations of the employee handbook or the employee policy or policies and procedures, some other document. If there's a reference to some other document, there's going to be expectations in there that you're bound to. You should insist to take a look at that before you sign this agreement.
So what's common there? How often do these supplementary documents exist? And when should there be an exchange of documents so that an employee can see the document?
The expectation of this document, right? This external document will be often given after your first day or after your first week, right? Well into, you've already signed the agreement, you've already started working, you've gotten credentialed. We're recommending that you ask for this document well before even starting, well before signing this. You want to review it, and this doesn't have to be an aggressive thing. You don't have to insist that you see the document. You politely recommend or ask for the document because you want to understand the full policies and the procedures of the employer before you start working.
Right.
All right, so this next section we're going to breeze through because this could be very different, right? It really depends on what the employer is able to offer, what position they're in to give you additional compensation. Oftentimes it's called benefits. But malpractice insurance, that should be covered, okay? If that's not, it could be an indication that, this employer doesn't have everything put together.
I would look at the overall compensation package. Malpractice insurance is something that you should 100% have on your own, and likely the employer should have their own policy as well. I think most of the time, if I was an employer, I'd be covering it because as an employee, the things like insurance, health insurance, malpractice insurance, those are the things that make an employee nervous. So they just want to know that they're covered for those things.
Right.
If an employer didn't have it, at the same time, I know it's really not too expensive for a physical therapist, so I would just go and get my own policy if I didn't see it in an employment agreement for myself. But like you described, it should be in there, for sure.
Similarly, continuing education, this is industry standard. You need to do it every year, right? Oftentimes an employer will compensate you for it. If they don't, that's not necessarily a red flag, but these are things that you may see and some things that, small things you might be able to negotiate at some point.
I think that's the bigger point there. When it comes to negotiations, again, we're not going to cover it in full here, but it's a lot of times it's a lot easier to negotiate benefits than it is to negotiate base pay or specific salary requirements.
Agreed, and here's one where I think there is a lot of wiggle room for negotiation is vacation, okay? Vacation time. We hear stories of burnout for new graduates going into their the first and second years of employment. We talked about hours and scope creep. We talked about potentially doing things that you didn't expect to be doing. There's high likelihood of really, really working harder than maybe you ever have and burning out in a short period of time. Vacation and benefits are designed to counterbalance that. As a rule of thumb, what we see is a on the real low end of vacation time is less than 10 days a year. On the higher end would be 15 days a year. If you're somewhere in between that, that's standard. But you know yourself and your body and your family time better than anybody else. Is 2 weeks going to be enough? Is this something that you may want to tell your employer from the get-go that you have planned vacations already scheduled, and try to get pre-approval for that?
Mm-hmm. And I think the big thing to consider with vacation time as well is both paid time off and unpaid time off. What would happen if I took some unpaid time off if I run out of paid time off?
Correct.
Is that an immediate dismissal or whatever it might be? So just at least to have those conversations with an employer on paid time off and also unpaid time off if additional vacation time is something that you'd want to consider, which an employer, they may not want to pay for 4 vacations for you a year or whatever it might be.
Correct.
Which is definitely reasonable from the employer standpoint as well.
Agreed. And same thing with holidays. Holidays are not mandatory to be given off, but often they're included. So you just want to take a look at your own schedule and understand your expectations with your employer. The next section here, sick days. Look at your local laws. This particular clause, 3 days, feels a little light, at least in California, it's higher. So you'll just want to take a look and make sure that the agreement is compliant with what's going on locally for you. And then maternity leave. Family paid leave is a jurisdiction by jurisdiction consideration. If you, before starting employment, have thoughts of growing a family, that's something that you should build, again, with expectations with your employer. This seems like a generous retirement plan. That's not always guaranteed. And then let's just finish up this contract. We've got a few more clauses that we just want to address relatively quickly. Atwill Employment. This is relatively standard. It does vary state by state, but sometimes this may feel brand new to you and confusing. Atwill Employment is exactly how it sounds. The employer, and it cuts both ways. The employer at will at any time for any reason or no reason at all can let you go. On the flip side, you, for any reason or no reason at all, can leave. Now again, some jurisdictions in some states will not actually enforce that, but most contracts will include an at-will employment and a termination clause like this. Last important section we want to talk about is non-solicitation and non-compete. This particular clause, often these topics are all embedded into one clause, and it's designed in a way to be glossed over, and it really shouldn't. This should be split up into 3 different clauses. There's non-solicitation of personnel, non-solicitation of patients, and non-competition. Non-solicitation of personnel, that means, hey, if you're leaving a job, they're politely asking and potentially can enforce the contract. They don't want you bad-mouthing the employer and saying, hey, you guys should all leave for this brand new employer that I just got hired for. That's to protect the employer, and generally that's reasonable. Non-solicitation of patients. This goes into a complete other topic of patient records and patient selection of their care providers. At the end of the day, the patient can choose their care provider and follow you if they want to, wherever they go. Oftentimes it'll be written that they can't. So this is something that you just want to be aware of in the event that you do develop really good patient relationships and you do leave this particular employer for somewhere else. You want to be careful and consult a professional if there is the potential for some type of conflict with your previous employer.
And does that have to do with actually soliciting the patient to come with you versus them engaging you? Is there a line there?
It's a line, and it's a gray line. What's enforceable is solicitation. Straight up telling them, hey, you should follow me, and mouthing the employer again. You should follow me because this employer is not where you should be going. You should be going to this new clinic. That's a violation, generally speaking. But simply informing them that you're leaving and going to somewhere else is not a violation. It's a bit of a gray line, and you want to tread carefully. Last part here is non-competition. So if you are going to a different employer. There's often a non-competition clause for a period of 1 to 3 years, which oftentimes is unreasonable and unenforceable, that you can't go to a competing employer within a certain radius of the previous employer. That could be really relevant and actually enforceable in some situations, like a rural part of America, where there are only 1 or 2 clinics within a 20-mile radius. A non-competition clause could be enforceable there. It all comes down to reasonability and expectations, and it's really about exiting and leaving with grace and on good terms with your employer, if that ever comes.
Awesome. So I think one of the biggest takeaway points here is don't be afraid of an employment agreement. It helps both you and the employer because it's a document that's going to set expectations. There's going to be a lot of these terms that Danny just was going over with you, the sections in the contracts, and some of the, as they're called, legalese in there might be confusing to you. Just real quick, what does that term legalese mean, and why do people use it so frequently?
Legalese means words written in a way that is generally confusing to non-trained individuals. It's often written that way intentionally because the employer is protecting the employer's rights.
All right, cool. So thank you for taking us through that contract. We're going to move on. We actually have a few questions here from Instagram, which I will let you field on that side of things. And just for clarification on the end there, don't be afraid of an employment agreement. Employment agreements are good for both you as the employee and for the employer because they set expectations. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're clear on what's in there, and if you need any clarification, you want to bring that up with the employer beforehand. It's not necessarily that you need to negotiate things out or into the contract, but you definitely want to clarify points if there's anything that is vague or written in a way that is maybe a little bit confusing or you don't understand completely.
Clarification and expectations.
Okay, before we go to Instagram, Danny, where can we hear more from you, or where can our audience find you and contact you?
It's at virtualcounsel.com, at virtual counsel, COUNSEL.com. You can reach me at Danny at virtualcounsel.com.
Great. All right, let's go to Instagram.
Do I need an attorney to review my contract before signing it? The answer is not necessarily. It really depends on your level of comfort with what's in the contract, your level of sophistication in reading contracts like this. Are you nervous? Are you completely comfortable with just signing whatever was put in front of you and starting? Do you have a good relationship with this employer prior, or do you not really know what you're getting into? We are able to help. If you have any questions along the way, just reach out to one of the staff members at Covalent Careers, and we could, point you in the right direction if you need some help. I have a retention clause in my contract. If I leave before the end of the retention clause, would I lose my bonus? The short answer is most likely yes. We often see something called a retention clause in these contracts, which is designed to keep you in an otherwise at-will employment contract for longer than a year or two, often three to more. In exchange for your agreement to go to be employed for this period of time, you're often given a signing bonus. And that signing bonus is often a hefty sum, or a reasonably hefty sum. And so an employer who gives you the signing bonus with an understanding that you're going to stay for a certain amount of time has grounds to claw that back if you don't stick to your agreement to stay for the amount of time that you did. Here's a really good one. My employer has offered the opportunity for potential revenue share and even ownership in the practice. What should I do? This is a really interesting one that is probably a little out of scope of this particular video. revenue share, and in particular ownership is far more complex and delicate than an employment agreement. What that really puts you into is a partnership, some type of partnership level with the other owner or owners of the practice. That's something that we would highly recommend you consult somebody else, a professional, to help you understand what you're getting into and negotiate terms for yourself.